Mother's Day was the day I finally understood that sometimes the deepest heartbreak does not come from strangers. It comes from the people who know exactly where your heart is and choose to press on it anyway. If someone had told me that one ordinary Sunday in May would end with me walking away from everything I had called home, I would have smiled politely and said they were wrong. But that morning, my own family handed me a coffee mug that read, "World's Most Useless Woman," and somehow every person sitting around that dining table managed to laugh as if it were the funniest thing they had ever seen. My mother-in-law raised her glass first. "Come on, Emily," Margaret said with a grin. "You have to admit it is accurate." My brother-in-law Brian nearly spilled his drink laughing. Jessica covered her mouth, pretending to feel guilty, but she never once told anyone to stop. My husband, Daniel, looked down at his plate before finally forcing a smile that hurt far more than the joke itself. "It is just a prank," he said quietly. "Do not make today awkward." I wrapped both hands around the warm mug even though my fingers suddenly felt cold. I smiled because I had forgotten how to do anything else. I thanked them for the gift. I stood up from the table. I wished every mother there a happy Mother's Day. Then I walked out of the house without raising my voice once. 10 days later, those same people would be asking complete strangers across the internet to help them find me. They still believed they understood who I was. They had no idea how much of my life had remained invisible to them. Before I tell you how everything unfolded, I would like to ask one small favor. If this story speaks to your heart, please consider liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and leaving a comment. Tell me where you are watching from and what your local time is right now. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel and how many lives they quietly touch. My name is Emily Carter. I am 33 years old, and I used to believe that keeping the peace was the same thing as keeping a family together. I was wrong. The afternoon that changed my life began with sunshine pouring through the maple trees outside my mother-in-law's house in Asheville, North Carolina. The neighborhood looked exactly the way greeting cards promised Mother's Day should look. Fresh flowers lined every front porch. Children rode bicycles down the quiet street. Someone across the block was grilling hamburgers before noon. Everything looked warm and ordinary. I carried a homemade blueberry pie through the front door because Margaret always insisted store-bought desserts lacked love. "Emily is here," Richard called from the living room without looking away from the baseball game. "She actually made the pie this year," Jessica joked. "I was afraid she would be too busy doing whatever it is she does all day." A few people laughed. Daniel leaned over and kissed my cheek. "Ignore them," he whispered. "You know how my family is." I nodded. I always nodded. The dining room smelled like roasted turkey, butter, and fresh rosemary. Family photographs covered every wall. There were graduation portraits, wedding pictures, and framed vacation memories from years before I married into the family. I noticed something that I had stopped noticing years ago. I was in almost none of them. Margaret clapped her hands together. "Before we eat, presents." Small gift bags were passed around the table. Richard received a leather wallet. Helen, my stepmother-in-law, opened a silk scarf. Jessica handed Margaret a framed family photograph. Then Brian slid a brightly wrapped box toward me. "This one is special," he announced. "Open it." I carefully peeled away the paper. Inside sat a white ceramic mug with gold lettering, "World's Most Useless Woman." For one brief second, the room became completely silent. Then Brian laughed first. Jessica followed. Richard chuckled into his napkin. Margaret smiled with unmistakable satisfaction. "Well?" she asked. "Do you like it?" I looked at Daniel. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "They are only teasing," he said. "Just laugh." "Daniel," I asked softly, "did you know about this?" His eyes drifted toward the table. "Brian mentioned it yesterday. You could have stopped it." He rubbed the back of his neck. "It would have turned into an argument." Margaret crossed her arms. "Honestly, Emily, everyone contributes something to this family. Brian runs his business. Jessica teaches. Daniel works 60 hours every week. Richard still manages investments. What exactly do you do besides rearrange furniture and answer emails?" "Mom," Daniel muttered. "No," she interrupted. "Let her answer." I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. Not because I lacked an answer, because I suddenly realized none of them had ever truly asked before. Brian pointed at the mug. "Maybe keep it on your desk. It can motivate you." More laughter followed. I slid the mug gently back into its box. "Thank you," I said. My own voice sounded strangely calm. That was thoughtful. Margaret blinked, almost disappointed. "You are leaving already?" she asked as I reached for my purse. "The food is almost ready. I hope all of you enjoy the afternoon," I replied. Daniel stood halfway from his chair. "Emily, come on, do not be dramatic." I smiled at him with a kindness I no longer felt. "I am not." I walked to my car without looking back. The blueberry pie remained untouched on the kitchen counter. I drove with the windows down, letting the cool mountain air fill the silence inside the car. I did not cry. Not yet. At a red light, my phone buzzed with a message from Daniel. "You embarrassed everyone by leaving." I stared at the screen until it went dark again. As I reached my driveway, another notification appeared. This one was not from Daniel. It was an email with a subject line I had not expected to see that afternoon. Someone had accessed a private file connected to a part of my life that none of them even knew existed, and for the first time, I realized that the cruel gift at Mother's Day might not have been the only secret waiting for me. The notification stayed on my phone long after the screen went dark. I sat in my driveway with both hands resting on the steering wheel, listening to the engine idle. A mockingbird sang somewhere across the street. A lawn sprinkler clicked back and forth in slow rhythm. The neighborhood looked exactly the same as it had that morning, but I no longer felt like I belonged in it. The email subject line was brief: "Unauthorized access detected." I read it 3 times before locking my phone and slipping it into my purse. Whoever had signed into that account had not managed to get very far. According to the security alert, the login attempt had been blocked. Still, it unsettled me. Hardly anyone even knew that account existed. I stepped inside the house that Daniel and I had shared for nearly 7 years. It was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the soft ticking of the clock above the stove. His shoes were still by the front door. My cardigan still hung over the back of a dining chair. Everything looked ordinary. That was the strange thing about difficult marriages. They usually looked perfectly normal until someone had lived inside them long enough to recognize the silence. I placed the wrapped mug on the kitchen counter without opening the box again. I could still feel the smooth ceramic pressing against my palms. My grandmother used to tell me that people rarely reveal themselves all at once. "Pay attention to the little things," she would say while washing dishes after Sunday dinner. Respect and disrespect both arrive quietly before they become loud. I never understood what she meant until I married into the Carter family. My phone buzzed again. "Daniel, can we talk?" I answered after the 3rd call. "You embarrassed my parents today," he said before I could speak. His voice sounded tired rather than angry. I left without arguing. That was the argument. I closed my eyes. "Daniel, your family gave me a mug, calling me the world's most useless woman." There was a pause. "You know how Brian jokes. Does everyone joke the same way every year?" He exhaled slowly. "Emily, please, do not do this tonight." I looked around the kitchen. The curtains I had sewn myself moved gently in the breeze from the open window. The herbs on the windowsill needed watering. The grocery list was still attached to the refrigerator with a magnet from our trip to the Blue Ridge Parkway 5 years earlier. I remembered standing there with Daniel shortly after we were married. "Mom can be difficult," he had warned me then. "Just give her time." I had smiled and answered, "Families grow together." I believed it. Back then I believed almost everything. After we ended the call, I wandered through the house collecting ordinary things that suddenly carried unexpected memories. A faded oven mitt reminded me of my first Thanksgiving with the family. Margaret had taken one bite of the stuffing before saying, "Next year let us have someone who actually knows how to handle dinner." Everyone had laughed while I quietly cleared the plates. A small crack in the hallway wall reminded me of the Christmas when Brian accidentally knocked over a bookshelf. Margaret had blamed me because I had chosen the paint color. "Everything has been falling apart since Emily started making decisions," she had said. Daniel had remained silent that day, too. There had always been a reason. It was not the right moment. His mother was under stress. His brother had been drinking. His sister did not mean it that way. Excuses have a strange way of becoming traditions if nobody interrupts them. I opened the hall closet to put away my coat and noticed an old cardboard box tucked behind winter blankets. Inside were birthday cards, ticket stubs, and photographs from the first years of my marriage. Daniel looked younger in those pictures. So did I. There was one photograph from a county fair where we were both laughing over powdered sugar-covered funnel cake. Margaret stood beside us wearing the same tight smile she still wore today. On the back of the photograph, someone had written, "Welcome to the family, Emily." The handwriting belonged to Richard. I traced the faded ink with my thumb and wondered when welcome had quietly become tolerated. Near the bottom of the box lay a folded envelope addressed to me. I recognized Jessica's handwriting immediately. It was a thank you note from years ago after I had spent an entire weekend helping her prepare lesson plans for a new teaching position. One sentence caught my attention. "I do not know how you always manage to fix everyone's problems without asking for anything back." I smiled sadly. At one point she had noticed, somehow that version of her had disappeared. The sun had nearly set when I carried a load of laundry upstairs. Daniel's home office door stood slightly open. I had no intention of going inside, but a faint notification sound came from his desk. His laptop screen had awakened by itself. A messaging window remained open. I only caught a few words before the display dimmed again. "She still does not know." Followed by, "Keep it that way until." The sender's name disappeared before I could read the rest. I stood motionless in the hallway, my hand still gripping the laundry basket. For years I had believed I understood exactly why my marriage had slowly become smaller, colder, and lonelier. But as I stared at that dark screen, I felt the quiet certainty settle over me that someone had been protecting a truth I had never even thought to question. I stood in the hallway for several long seconds after the laptop screen went black. The laundry basket felt heavier than it should have, as though every neatly folded towel inside had quietly absorbed another year of silence. I did not touch the computer. I did not try to wake the screen again. Whatever conversation I had almost seen belonged to a part of my marriage that had been hidden from me for a long time, and I suddenly understood that forcing the truth into the light too quickly would only leave me with half of it. I carried the laundry into our bedroom and placed Daniel's shirts inside the dresser exactly the way I always had. Left side, work shirts in front, weekend clothes behind them. My hands knew the routine better than my mind did. The front door opened downstairs just after 7. "Emily?" Daniel called. His voice sounded unusually cheerful. I heard his keys land in the ceramic bowl near the entrance. "Are you home?" I walked downstairs slowly. He loosened his tie while looking at his phone instead of at me. "We need to talk," he said. "I thought so," I answered. He smiled, but it was the kind of smile people wear before asking for something they have already decided they deserve. "Mom feels terrible about today." I waited. Well, maybe terrible is not the right word. He rubbed the back of his neck. "She thinks things got out of hand." "Did she tell you that herself?" "Not exactly." He pulled out a dining chair. "Sit down." I remained standing. Daniel sighed. "Emily, we have another family dinner next Saturday. I think it would help if you apologized for leaving early." For a moment I wondered if I had misunderstood him. "You want me to apologize, just for walking out, not for anything else?" He looked away. "It would make everything easier." I nodded once, more to myself than to him. Easier had become one of Daniel's favorite words over the years. Easier usually meant quieter, smaller, less visible. I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water. He followed me. "There is something else." Of course there was. "Brian has been talking to Mom about Grandpa's lake cabin." I rested my glass on the counter. "What about it?" "The family is thinking about transferring ownership into a trust." His tone remained casual, almost rehearsed. "It would simplify things later. I thought your grandfather already had a legal arrangement." "He does." Daniel hesitated. "They just want everyone to sign a few updated documents." Something inside me became very still. Years ago, before we were married, Daniel had laughed at how carefully I read every contract, every warranty, every insurance policy. "You never sign anything without reading it," he used to tease. I smiled at the memory, although it no longer felt warm. "Who prepared the paperwork?" I asked. "Brian knows a guy." "A lawyer?" "A consultant." I looked directly at him. "I will read everything first." His shoulders stiffened almost imperceptibly. "Of course." But disappointment crossed his face before he could hide it. My phone buzzed against the counter. The caller ID displayed Margaret. Daniel reached for the phone before I could. "I will put her on speaker." "Daniel." He had already answered. "Emily?" Margaret's voice carried through the kitchen. "I have been thinking." "Have you?" I asked quietly. This family has always welcomed you, but lately you seem distant." I said nothing. She continued. "Daniel mentioned the cabin paperwork. I know legal documents can be confusing, dear. Brian can explain everything. You really do not need to trouble yourself with the details." Daniel gave me a quick glance that almost looked like a warning. I leaned against the counter. "I appreciate the offer," I replied. "I still prefer reading documents myself." Silence lingered for a heartbeat too long. Then Margaret laughed lightly. Always so cautious. The call ended a minute later with polite goodbyes that sounded colder than arguments. Daniel slipped his phone back into his pocket. "You could have handled that differently." "How?" "You made Mom feel like you do not trust the family." I looked around our kitchen. Every cabinet door had been measured twice before I installed it. Every shelf had been leveled with care. Every corner of this house held pieces of quiet work that no one ever noticed because it had always simply been expected. "Trust is not something people ask for," I said softly. "It is something they leave behind." He frowned, but he did not answer. Later that night, while Daniel showered upstairs, I carried a box of household paperwork into the living room. I was not searching for anything specific. I simply wanted to organize old files, perhaps to quiet my thoughts. Receipts, utility bills, insurance renewals, property tax statements. Beneath them lay a sealed envelope with my name written across the front in Richard's handwriting. I had never seen it before. The envelope had not been opened. There was no stamp, no mailing date, only my name, Emily Carter. I turned it over in my hands. Before I could decide whether to open it, footsteps echoed above me. Instinctively, I slipped the envelope beneath a stack of folders just as Daniel entered the room. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Cleaning." His eyes moved briefly across the paperwork. For the first time all evening, I noticed genuine concern flash across his face. It disappeared almost immediately. "Do not stay up too late," he said. "We have a busy week." He walked back upstairs. I waited until I heard the bedroom door close. Then I reached for the envelope again. It was gone. Someone had removed it in the few seconds that Daniel stood in the room, and I realized with a chill that whatever truth had been hidden from me all these years was no longer simply being protected. Someone had just proven they were still actively protecting it. For several minutes, I searched every folder on the living room floor, convincing myself I must have misplaced the envelope. I lifted stacks of tax records, warranty papers, insurance statements, even old instruction manuals for appliances we no longer owned. It was nowhere. Daniel had been in the room for less than a minute. That was all it had taken. I carefully put everything back into the storage box exactly as I had found it. If someone had removed the envelope on purpose, I did not want them to know I had noticed. Sleep never really came that night. Around 4:30 the next morning, I stood on the back porch wrapped in a gray sweater, watching fog settle over the trees behind our house. The coffee in my mug had already gone cold. Birds began filling the silence one by one, their songs arriving before the sunrise itself. I remembered something my father used to say whenever life became confusing. When people work hard to hide something, do not chase them. Watch what they protect. Until that morning, I had believed the hidden thing was only my marriage. Now I was beginning to wonder if it reached much farther than that. By mid-morning, Daniel suggested we drive to his parents' house to look over the paperwork for the family trust. "It will only take an hour," he said while fastening his watch. "Mom wants everyone together." "Everyone?" I asked. "Brian, Jessica, Dad. The attorney is stopping by for a few minutes." That surprised me. The night before, he had described the paperwork as something Brian's consultant had prepared. Apparently, an attorney had become involved overnight. During the drive, Daniel kept the radio on low volume. We spoke only about ordinary things. Whether the lawn needed mowing. Whether we should replace the upstairs bathroom faucet. Married people can become strangely skilled at discussing everything except the one subject sitting between them. Margaret greeted us at the front door with practiced warmth. "There you are," she said. "We are waiting in the sunroom." Richard sat quietly beside the windows reading the newspaper. Brian was already spreading documents across the dining table, while Jessica arranged coffee cups on a tray. "Emily," Brian said with a grin, "today you can leave the legal language to the professionals." I smiled politely. Reading has always been one of my better habits. He laughed as though I had made a joke. 20 minutes later the doorbell rang. Margaret stood quickly. "That must be Mr. Whitmore." She opened the front door, and an older gentleman stepped inside carrying a leather briefcase worn smooth with age. His silver hair was neatly combed. His navy suit fit comfortably rather than expensively. Before Margaret could introduce anyone, his eyes settled on me. He stopped walking. For the briefest moment his expression changed from professional courtesy to unmistakable recognition. "Miss Carter," he said warmly. "It has been quite a while." The room fell completely still. I recognized him immediately. Thomas Whitmore. We had not spoken in nearly 4 years. "Good morning, Mr. Whitmore," I answered. "It is nice to see you again." He smiled in a way that carried genuine respect rather than surprise. "I was hoping our paths would cross again someday. I did not realize this was your family." Brian looked back and forth between us. "You two know each other?" Mr. Whitmore adjusted his glasses. "Professionally." His answer was brief. Nothing more. Yet the way he spoke to me was noticeably different from the way he greeted everyone else. He shook Richard's hand politely. He nodded to Margaret. But when he spoke to me, there was an unmistakable warmth, almost as though he expected me to understand something without saying it aloud. Margaret cleared her throat. "Well, let us get started." We gathered around the table. Mr. Whitmore opened his briefcase and reviewed several folders before pausing. "Before anyone signs anything," he said calmly, "I recommend that every individual review each document independently." Brian chuckled. "That seems unnecessary. We are family, Mr." Whitmore looked directly at him. "In my profession, family is precisely why careful reading matters." I noticed Daniel glance toward his mother. Neither of them spoke. Margaret forced a smile. "Emily tends to overthink paperwork anyway." Mr. Whitmore turned toward me. "I have always found Miss Carter to be exceptionally thorough." Again the room became quiet. I lowered my eyes to the papers in front of me, saying nothing. I could almost feel everyone's curiosity settling on me. Richard finally folded his newspaper. "Thomas," he said slowly, "how exactly do you know my daughter-in-law?" "Mr." Whitmore closed the folder in front of him. "We worked together on a matter several years ago." "Business?" Richard asked. "Something like that," he replied with a small smile. "I learned very quickly that Miss Carter asks excellent questions. It saved more than one person from making a costly mistake." Brian laughed dismissively. "Emily," he said, "you must have the wrong woman. She worries about paint colors and grocery coupons." Nobody joined his laughter. "Mr." Whitmore simply looked at Brian for a long moment before answering. "No," he said quietly. "I am quite certain I have the right woman." The conversation moved on, but the atmosphere had changed in a way no one could explain. Margaret became unusually careful with her words. Daniel avoided looking directly at me. Even Brian seemed uncertain whether to continue making jokes. I signed nothing. Neither did anyone else. As we prepared to leave, Mr. Whitmore walked beside me toward the front porch. He spoke softly enough that only I could hear. "I hope you are still keeping copies," he said. I met his eyes without answering. He gave the smallest nod, as though my silence confirmed everything he needed to know. When I turned back toward the driveway, I caught Daniel watching us from beside the car. His confident expression had disappeared. For the first time since I had joined his family, he looked at me as though he had suddenly realized he might not know his own wife at all. Daniel barely spoke during the drive home. The tires hummed against the pavement while the late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the Blue Ridge Parkway. Every few minutes I caught him glancing at me before looking back at the road, as though he were trying to solve a puzzle that had quietly existed beside him for years. Neither of us mentioned Thomas Whitmore. We did not have to. His unexpected respect had remained in the car with us like a third passenger. When we reached the house, Daniel carried his laptop into the dining room instead of his office. He answered emails with unusual intensity, pausing often to stare at the screen without typing. I watered the herbs in the kitchen window and listened to the faucet run longer than necessary. Ordinary sounds had become comforting because they still obeyed simple rules. Water flowed, clocks ticked, evening arrived. People, I was no longer certain about. Around 6 o'clock my phone vibrated. A message appeared from an unfamiliar number. "Good evening, Miss Carter. This is Thomas Whitmore. I hope you do not mind my reaching out. I wanted only to say that it was good to see you again. Please remember what I told you years ago. Keep your records organized. Someday they may become more valuable than you expect." I read the message twice before locking my phone. Daniel looked up from across the room. Who was that? Someone following up after today. Whitmore? I nodded. What exactly did you work on together? His question sounded casual, but his fingers had stopped moving across the keyboard. A professional matter. Doing what? I smiled gently. Helping people avoid expensive mistakes. He frowned. That is exactly what he said. Perhaps because it is true. He looked as though he wanted to ask another question, but instead returned to his work. I noticed him watching me several more times that evening. Curiosity had quietly replaced certainty. The following morning I drove downtown to return several library books that were overdue by 2 days. Asheville's streets were beginning to fill with tourists carrying coffee cups and cameras. Spring flowers lined the sidewalks outside local shops. It felt comforting to disappear into an ordinary crowd where no one expected me to explain myself. As I stepped out of the library, an elderly woman sitting on a nearby bench smiled warmly. "Emily?" she asked. I recognized her immediately. Mrs. Evelyn Brooks had volunteered with a local community foundation for decades. Years earlier, our paths had crossed during a complicated neighborhood preservation project. "Mrs. Brooks," I said, walking over. "It has been too long." She reached for my hands. "I heard you were still in town. I have been hoping I would run into you." Before I could answer, another volunteer approached carrying several folders. "Mrs. Brooks, the board meeting starts in 15 minutes. She turned toward him with a smile. "You know who this is, do not you?" The young man shook his head. "This is the woman I have told all of you about. The one who helped keep the East Walnut Housing Initiative alive when everyone else believed it would fail." I felt heat rise into my face. It was a team effort. Mrs. Brooks laughed softly. "You always say that." She squeezed my hand once before lowering her voice. "Some of those families still ask about you." I thanked her quietly. We spoke for only a few more minutes before she headed inside. As I walked back toward my car, I found myself smiling for the first time in days. Not because of praise, but because someone had remembered me for kindness rather than usefulness. When I arrived home, Daniel was standing in the garage holding a cardboard box. "I found this while cleaning the attic," he said. "It has your name on it." The box contained old notebooks, sketches, receipts, and several framed photographs from years before we married. One picture showed me standing beside a renovated brick building with a group of volunteers wearing work gloves and dusty jeans. Daniel picked it up. "I have never seen this." "It was a community restoration project. You never told me. I looked at the photograph. You never asked." He said nothing. Later that evening, while sorting through the papers, I discovered handwritten thank you letters from people whose names I had almost forgotten. A retired teacher, a single father, a local business owner. None of the letters mentioned money. They thanked me for listening, organizing, negotiating, connecting people, solving problems quietly before they became disasters. Daniel stood behind me reading over my shoulder. There are dozens of these. I kept them because they reminded me that difficult work sometimes matters even when no one notices. He sat down across from me. "Emily, why have I never heard about any of this?" I considered the question carefully, because every time I tried to talk about my work, someone changed the subject. His shoulders lowered. There was no anger in his expression now, only uncertainty. For years he had accepted his family's version of me without examining whether it matched the woman who shared his home every day. The silence between us felt different than it had before. Not comfortable, but honest. My phone rang just before bedtime. I glanced at the screen and saw Brian's name. I let it go to voicemail. A minute later, another notification appeared. This time it was not a call. It was a photograph that Brian had accidentally sent to the entire family group instead of a private conversation. The image showed several documents spread across Margaret's dining room table. Most of the pages were too blurry to read, but one folder stood perfectly clear. Across the tab, in bold black letters, someone had written my full name followed by a word that made my heartbeat slow to a stop. Confidential. My thumb hovered over the family group message for several seconds before I enlarged the photograph. The image became grainy, but the folder tab remained unmistakably clear. My full name. Beneath it, a single typed word. Confidential. Brian deleted the photograph less than a minute later, replacing it with another message. Wrong picture. Ignore that. No one replied. I doubted anyone believed him. I set my phone down on the kitchen table and stared out the window. The wind moved gently through the dogwood tree in the backyard. Somewhere beyond the fence, a neighbor was mowing the lawn. Ordinary sounds continued as if nothing had shifted, but something had. The balance that had held my marriage together for years had begun to crack under the weight of small truths that no one could push back into hiding. Daniel came home later than usual that evening. He loosened his tie before he even reached the kitchen. His eyes found mine immediately. "Did Brian send you that picture?" he asked. "Yes. It was an accident. I assumed it was." He stood quietly for a moment, then opened the refrigerator without taking anything out. "Mom is upset." "About the picture?" "About everything." I folded a dish towel and placed it neatly beside the sink. "That is understandable." He looked frustrated by my calmness. "Emily, why are you acting like none of this surprises you?" I thought about answering quickly, but silence often reveals more than hurried words. "Because surprises usually happen all at once," I said. "This has been happening one small piece at a time for years." He rubbed his forehead. "You make it sound like we have all been hiding something." I met his eyes. "Have you?" He did not answer. The following afternoon, Richard called for the first time in months. Usually, family communication traveled through Margaret or Daniel. Hearing his voice directly felt unusual. "Emily," he said quietly, "would you mind meeting me for coffee?" Of course. We met at a small cafe downtown where retired couples lingered over newspapers and college students filled the corner tables with laptops and textbooks. Richard looked older than I remembered only a week earlier. He stirred his coffee absent-mindedly without adding sugar. "I owe you an apology," he said. I looked at him but remained silent. I have spent years assuming that keeping peace in my family meant staying quiet. He sighed. "I am beginning to think silence has been the most expensive choice I ever made." His words settled gently between us. They were not dramatic. They were simply honest. "Richard," I said softly, "I never expected anyone to choose sides." He nodded slowly. "Perhaps I should have chosen what was right instead." Before either of us could continue, someone approached our table. "Richard?" a familiar voice asked. We both looked up. Thomas Whitmore smiled politely. "I did not realize you two had already met again." Richard stood and shook his hand. "Thomas." Then, almost instinctively, Thomas turned toward me first. "Good afternoon, Miss Carter." His tone carried the same quiet respect it had at Margaret's house. "I hope everything is well." "As well as it can be," I replied. He gave a small nod that suggested he understood more than I had said aloud. Richard noticed the exchange immediately. "Thomas," he asked carefully, "may I ask you something?" "You may." "Have I underestimated my daughter-in-law?" Thomas smiled faintly. "That is a question only you can answer." Richard waited. Thomas added only one more sentence. "In my experience, the people who speak the least about their accomplishments are often the ones carrying the greatest responsibilities." Then he excused himself and walked toward another table across the cafe. Richard remained quiet for a long time. Finally, he looked at me. "Emily, how much do I actually know about your life?" I smiled sadly. "Probably about as much as you ever wanted to ask." He lowered his eyes. There was no defense left in his expression, only regret. Later that evening, the family group chat became unusually active. Margaret insisted everyone meet again on Saturday. Brian complained that people were making ordinary paperwork into a conspiracy. Jessica remained silent. Daniel typed several messages before deleting them without sending. I watched the conversation unfold without joining it. Around 9 o'clock, my phone rang again. It was Thomas. "I apologize for the late call," he said. "There is something you should know." I listened quietly. "Someone contacted my office this afternoon asking whether I had ever represented you personally. I declined to discuss any client matters." "Who called?" I asked. "They did not identify themselves." He paused, but I recognized the voice. I waited. "It was your husband." I closed my eyes for a moment, not because I felt angry, but because something inside me finally settled into certainty. Daniel had started looking for answers without asking me a single question. "Thank you for telling me," I said. "There is one more thing," Thomas continued. "If anyone asks again, I will respond exactly the same way I always have. Which is? His voice became very calm. That everything important has always been documented. After the call ended, I found Daniel sitting alone in the living room with his laptop closed in front of him. He looked up as I entered. For the first time since we married, I could see uncertainty replacing confidence in his eyes. Before either of us spoke, another notification appeared on my phone. It was not from Thomas. It was from an unknown sender, containing only a scanned page with an official letterhead and one handwritten sentence across the bottom. The original record has finally been located. The scanned document remained on my phone long after the notification faded. I did not open it immediately. Over the past week, I had learned that rushing toward answers often meant missing the questions that came first. Instead, I set the phone on the kitchen counter and poured myself a cup of tea. The kettle whistled softly, filling the quiet house with an ordinary sound that somehow made everything feel steadier. Daniel watched me from the living room doorway. "You are not even going to look?" he asked. "I will," I replied, "just not while I am upset." He frowned. "How can you stay so calm?" I wrapped both hands around the warm mug, because panic has never helped me understand anything. He lowered his eyes. I could tell he wanted to ask about the message, but for the first time since we had met, he seemed unsure whether he had earned the right. Later that evening, I opened the attachment. It was only a cover page from an archived file. Most of the information had been redacted, but one line remained visible near the bottom. Original documentation transferred to secure storage. Attached inventory verified. No explanation. No names beyond my own. No indication of what the file actually contained. Yet it matched Thomas Whitmore's words almost perfectly. Everything important had been documented. I locked my phone again. Across the room, Daniel was pretending to watch television, but the same scene had been playing for several minutes without either of us noticing. The next morning, Margaret called before breakfast. I could hear several voices talking in the background before she spoke. "Emily, we need everyone at the house this afternoon." "Why?" "There has been a misunderstanding." Her tone was sharper than usual. "About the family documents. I thought everyone agreed not to sign anything. Just come." She ended the call without waiting for an answer. Daniel drove in complete silence. Rain had started falling over Asheville, turning the windshield into shifting patterns of gray and silver. When we arrived, Brian was already pacing across the living room. Jessica stood near the fireplace with her arms folded tightly. Richard remained seated in his usual chair, looking more tired than angry. Margaret was the first to speak. "Someone has been asking questions outside this family." Brian immediately pointed toward me. "It has to be Emily." I looked at him quietly. "About what?" "Do not play innocent." He held up several printed emails. "Thomas Whitmore refused to answer basic questions about you." Richard interrupted before I could respond. "Brian, perhaps that is because they were not your questions to ask." Brian turned toward his father. "You are taking her side now? I am asking for fairness." Margaret stepped between them. "Enough." She faced me. "Emily, if there is something we should know, this would be the time." I answered honestly. "There are many things you could have known over the years if anyone had asked." The room fell silent again. No one argued with that. Jessica looked down at the floor. "I remember asking once," she said quietly. Everyone turned toward her. "Years ago. About Emily's volunteer work. Mom said it was just another hobby." Margaret stiffened. "Jessica." "No." Jessica shook her head. "I remember because Emily spent almost every weekend helping people while the rest of us joked that she was wasting her time." Brian scoffed. "You cannot seriously be rewriting history." "I am remembering it," Jessica replied. Richard spoke next. His voice remained calm. "There are a great many things this family never bothered to remember." Daniel shifted uncomfortably beside me. "Dad." Richard looked directly at his son. "When was the last time you asked your wife about her work?" Daniel opened his mouth but did not answer. "When was the last time," Richard continued, "you asked what she cared about?" The silence stretched longer this time. I watched Daniel struggle with the question, not because he lacked an answer, but because he had finally realized the truthful one. Brian threw the printed emails onto the coffee table. "This is ridiculous. We are acting like Emily has been living some secret double life." No, Richard said softly. We are acting like perhaps we never bothered to know the life she was already living. Margaret crossed her arms. Richard, you are making assumptions based on one attorney being polite. Before anyone could reply, the front doorbell rang. Jessica answered it. A courier stood outside carrying a flat document envelope. Delivery for Miss Emily Carter, he said. Every conversation in the room stopped. Jessica accepted the envelope and handed it to me. My name had been typed neatly across the front, along with the words personal and confidential. Brian laughed nervously. Another mystery. No one joined him. I opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a brief letter from an archival records office acknowledging receipt of a request and confirming that certified copies of historical documents had been located and would be released, according to the original authorization, already on file. Richard looked at me with quiet concern. Did you request those? No, I answered truthfully. Not recently. Brian's confidence began to crack for the first time. Then who did? Nobody knew, or at least nobody admitted knowing. Margaret looked toward Daniel as if expecting him to explain the situation. Instead, he stared at the letter in my hands, his expression shifting from confusion to genuine unease. Whatever certainty had held his family together for years was beginning to dissolve under questions none of them could answer. As I folded the letter and slipped it back into the envelope, I realized I was no longer standing in the center of their conflict. They had quietly stepped into one of their own, and for the first time I watched them searching one another's faces instead of mine, each wondering who else had been keeping secrets all along. The room slowly emptied after the courier left. Nobody seemed interested in continuing the discussion about family paperwork anymore. Brian gathered the scattered documents without his usual confidence. Margaret stood by the dining room window, watching the rain slide down the glass. Richard quietly offered to drive Jessica home, and she accepted without hesitation. For the first time since I had married into the Carter family, no one seemed certain who should speak first. Daniel and I drove home through the same steady rain. The windshield wipers moved back and forth with quiet precision, separating one clear moment from the next before allowing the water to blur everything again. That rhythm somehow matched the way my thoughts felt. Certain for a second, uncertain the next. Halfway home, Daniel turned down the radio. "Emily," he said softly, "can I ask you something?" "You just did." A faint smile appeared on his face before disappearing again. "Why did you stay?" I looked out the passenger window at the mountains fading into mist. "What do you mean? You could have left years ago." I considered the question carefully. "Because I believed people could grow." He nodded once. "And now?" I let the silence answer before speaking. "Now I think people only grow when they are willing to see themselves honestly." He gripped the steering wheel a little tighter. "Do you think I can?" I looked at him for a long moment. "I do not know. That answer belongs to you, not me." He said nothing else for the rest of the drive. The following morning I woke before sunrise. The house felt unusually peaceful. Instead of opening my email or checking my phone, I walked outside carrying only a light jacket and a travel mug filled with coffee. Asheville always seemed different before the city fully awakened. The sidewalks were nearly empty. Bakery lights glowed softly through front windows. A cyclist rolled quietly down the street, while birds settled into the old oak trees lining the park. I found myself sitting on the same bench where I had once shared lunch with my grandmother many years earlier. She used to tell me that every life leaves two kinds of footprints. One where people remember what you accomplished, and another where people remember how they felt when they were with you. The second one lasts longer, she always said. As I sat there, my phone vibrated. It was Jessica. "Can we meet?" she asked quietly. We met later that afternoon at a small coffee shop downtown. She looked tired. Not from lack of sleep, but from carrying something heavy inside her heart. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup before speaking. "I owe you an apology." I did not interrupt. I laughed at things I should have stopped. Her eyes remained fixed on the table, sometimes because I wanted Mom's approval, sometimes because it was easier. I nodded gently. "Thank you for saying that." Tears gathered in her eyes. "You are not angry?" I was hurt. I smiled sadly. Those are not always the same thing. She reached into her purse and slid a small envelope across the table. I found this while helping Mom organize old files. I looked at it but did not open it. "You should have it." "Did you read it?" She shook her head immediately. No, it had your name on it. I placed the envelope inside my bag. Thank you. She hesitated before asking one final question. Emily, were we completely wrong about you? I thought carefully before answering. You were not wrong because you lacked information. You were wrong because no one thought I was worth asking. She quietly wiped away a tear. Before leaving, she hugged me for the first time since I had known her. It was brief, awkward, and completely sincere. That evening, I drove to the neighborhood community center, where volunteers were preparing meals for several families displaced by recent flooding. I had promised weeks earlier that I would help, long before everything inside my own life had begun to change. Mrs. Brooks smiled the moment she saw me. I was hoping you would still come. I gave my word. She laughed softly. You always do. We spent hours packing food boxes, folding blankets, and carrying supplies into waiting vehicles. No one there cared about family arguments, legal documents, or hidden files. They only cared whether enough canned soup had been packed into each box and whether every child would have a warm blanket that night. It reminded me how strangely small my own worries became whenever I stood beside people quietly helping one another. As we finished cleaning up, a young volunteer asked me, "Why do you keep doing this?" I looked around the nearly empty room before answering. Because kindness is one of the few things that never becomes smaller when you give it away. Mrs. Brooks smiled without saying a word. When I returned home after dark, Daniel was sitting alone on the front porch. He stood as I approached. I made dinner, he said. I was not sure when you would be back. We ate quietly at the kitchen table. There was no pretending that everything had returned to normal. Somehow that felt healthier than pretending nothing had ever happened. Before going upstairs, he stopped beside my chair. Thank you, he said. For what? For becoming the kind of person who still helps strangers after everything you have been through. I looked at him gently. If I stopped becoming that person, then none of this would have been worth surviving. Later that night, I finally opened the envelope Jessica had given me. Inside was only a single handwritten note, folded around an old photograph I had never seen before. The picture showed me years earlier standing beside someone whose face had been carefully cut away. On the back, written in familiar handwriting, were only a few quiet words. One day, when you are finally ready, this picture will explain everything. The photograph rested on my kitchen table until morning. I looked at it several times before finally turning it over again. The missing face no longer bothered me as much as it once would have. I had spent years believing that every unanswered question demanded an immediate answer. Now I understood that some truths arrive only after we have become strong enough to carry them. The handwriting on the back was enough. It reminded me that someone, somewhere in my past, had believed I would eventually find my own way. That quiet confidence felt like a gift. A few days later, I met Thomas Whitmore one last time. We sat beneath the shade of an old oak tree outside his office while spring sunlight filtered through the leaves above us. He handed me a slim folder. Everything that belongs to you has now been returned, he said. I accepted it without opening it. Thank you. He smiled kindly. I believe you already know what matters most inside. I nodded. The papers are important, I said, but they are not the reason I came. No? I wanted to thank you for respecting my silence all these years. He looked toward the courthouse across the street before answering. Emily, every person deserves the opportunity to tell their own story when they are ready. That was never my story to tell. We shook hands before parting. I never asked him another question, and he never offered another explanation. Some relationships do not need many words to remain meaningful. Over the following weeks, I made several quiet decisions. Daniel and I agreed to separate with honesty rather than bitterness. We sat together one evening on the back porch where we had once planned our future, watching the sunset fade behind the mountains. I thought loving someone meant asking them to stay, he said softly. Sometimes, I replied. Loving someone means admitting you helped build the place they no longer feel safe calling home. Tears gathered in his eyes. I am sorry. This time I believed him. I know, I answered. And I hope one day you become the man who never allows silence to replace kindness again. We wished each other well. There were no dramatic arguments, no slammed doors, no cruel words. Just two people quietly accepting that respect cannot survive forever where it has never truly been protected. Richard continued calling every few weeks. Sometimes we spoke about books, sometimes about the garden he had finally planted behind the house. Once he said, "I spent too many years measuring people by the loudest voices in the room." I smiled. It is never too late to start listening instead. Jessica began volunteering with the same community organization where we had packed food boxes together. One afternoon, she admitted, "Helping strangers has changed the way I see my own family." I laughed gently. It changed me too. Brian remained distant for a long time. I heard through relatives that he had struggled after several business partnerships dissolved. Not because anyone sought revenge against him, but because trust, once weakened, is difficult to rebuild. Margaret wrote me a letter nearly 6 months after Mother's Day. She apologized without excuses. She did not ask me to return. She simply acknowledged the pain her words had caused and wished me peace. I folded the letter carefully and placed it inside a drawer. Forgiveness, I discovered, is not forgetting. It is choosing not to let another person's worst moment become the center of your own future. As for me, I accepted a full-time position coordinating community restoration and design projects across Western North Carolina. Every week I met families rebuilding homes, volunteers planting gardens, retired carpenters teaching young apprentices, and neighbors who still believed small acts of kindness could slowly change a town. They reminded me that meaningful lives are rarely built in dramatic moments. They are built one ordinary day at a time. The old coffee mug remained with me. I never threw it away. Instead, I placed it on a bookshelf in my office beside photographs of community projects, handwritten thank you notes, and a small framed picture of my grandmother. Visitors occasionally noticed the mug and asked why I kept it. I would simply smile and answer, "It reminds me never to let someone else decide who I am." The words printed on its side had long since lost their power. They had become evidence of how wrong people can be when they stop looking beyond appearances. 1 year later, on Mother's Day, our volunteer team hosted a luncheon for mothers, grandmothers, foster parents, and women who had quietly spent their lives caring for others. There were no expensive decorations, just fresh flowers from local gardens, homemade food, children's drawings taped to the walls, and long tables filled with laughter that asked nothing from anyone except presence. As I watched the room, I realized I no longer measured that holiday by what had once been taken from me. I measured it by what had finally grown in its place. Peace. If you are listening to my story while carrying wounds that nobody else seems to notice, I hope you remember something I had to learn slowly. Your value does not disappear because someone refuses to recognize it. Protect your dignity. Speak honestly when the time is right. Walk away from places that repeatedly ask you to become smaller just to make others more comfortable. Starting over is frightening, but living without self-respect is far more painful. Thank you for spending your time with me and allowing me to share this chapter of my life. I hope you felt a little less alone along the way. If this story touched your heart, I would be grateful if you left a like, subscribed to the channel, and shared your thoughts in the comments. Someone reading your words may discover they are not as alone as they believed. The greatest victory was never proving my worth to the people who underestimated me. It was finally believing it myself. And every time the morning sun reaches that old mug resting quietly on my bookshelf, I no longer see an insult. I see the first small step that led me home to the person I was always meant to become.